In the lonely hills of eastern Kentucky, where the fog rolls in like ghostly fingers at dawn, there once stood a place most maps refused to name. It was not because cartographers forgot. It was because Pine Hollow did not want to be remembered. You would not stumble upon Pine Hollow by accident. You would have to want to find it. You would have to brave winding mountain paths barely wide enough for a wagon, cross rivers with no bridges, and pass through stretches of woods so dense that the sun itself forgot how to shine there. And if you did make it, if you somehow arrived at the edge of that hollow, you would be greeted, not with welcome arms, but with cautious stares from behind curtained windows. Because Pine Hollow is a place with too many secrets. The kind of secrets that settle in the bones of old buildings and whisper through floorboards after midnight. It is the kind of place that exists on the edge of memory and myth. A settlement where the past was not just history, it was a living presence. And in the fall of 1834, when Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters arrived, something ancient stirred beneath the surface of Pine Hollow. Something buried. Something that refused to stay quiet. Kentucky, in those years, was a state split between two identities. To the west, the early stirrings of commerce, steamboats, trading posts, polite society. To the east, nothing but wilderness. There were no telegraphs here. No railroads. The people who lived in the mountain hollows did not trust outsiders, and they did not like change. Pine Hollow had been founded in 1818 by 3 devout Baptist families who wanted to escape the growing liberalism of bigger towns. They came with wagons, oxen, a few books of scripture, and a collective belief that the world outside was corrupt and unsavable. The church was the first thing they built. Not homes, not barns, a church. A squat wooden structure made from hewn pine logs dragged down from the slopes. Its pews were rough benches, its altar plain and unadorned. But it was holy, at least in their eyes. A sanctuary carved out of the wilderness. By 1834, the town had grown, if you could call 200 souls a town. Nearly all of them were related. Marriage was not about love in Pine Hollow. It was about preserving the faith, the bloodline, the secret, and the church remained at the center. Its spiritual anchor. Its moral judge. And, as history would prove, its burial ground, though not in the way one might think. The man who led Pine Hollow's flock in that fateful year was Pastor William Phillips, a quiet, measured figure with ink-stained fingers and a face lined by disappointment. He was not born in Pine Hollow. He had arrived 5 years earlier, abandoning a promising future in Lexington's theological circles for reasons never fully explained. Some say he had suffered a personal tragedy. Others claimed he simply grew tired of debates over doctrine and denomination. What is certain is that Pastor Phillips kept records. Obsessive records. Every birth, every death, every moment of spiritual significance. His journal entries read like autopsy reports of the soul, dry, clinical, but detailed beyond belief. It would be this habit, this relentless documentation, that would allow future generations to piece together what happened when the Morrison family arrived. Because when the truth came to light, it was not through visions or prophecy alone. It was through the pages of Pastor Phillips's journal. Pages that would be discovered nearly 150 years later, during the demolition of the old church. Pages that chilled historians, psychologists, and theologians alike. They arrived on foot. November 15, 1834. A cold dusk had already begun to sink its teeth into the hills when the first figure emerged from the trees. A man, tall, thin, wrapped in a threadbare coat. His gait was uneven, as if he had been carrying someone. Behind him came 2 girls, identical in form, in face, in age. 9 years old. One walked, one was carried. Their father, Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, was a known name among the mountain churches. A circuit preacher, a man who wandered from congregation to congregation, offering sermons and counsel to communities too small or too remote to have full-time clergy. But what made Ezekiel unusual was not his message, it was his children. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, they looked like 2 sides of the same coin, one lively, the other quiet, one smiling, the other solemn. Yet they shared something far deeper than appearance, something that would only become clear with time. And Pine Hollow, insulated and austere, would be the place where that something bloomed. The first sign that something was off came during supper. Pastor Phillips and his wife had invited the Morrison family to their modest home beside the church. As was custom, they offered warm stew, cornbread, and a place by the fire. Mrs. Phillips was a woman of routine. Her garden was her pride, especially the roses along the eastern fence. It was Rebecca, the more outspoken twin, who shattered the comfortable rhythm of dinner. "These must be the hands that saved the roses," she said to Mrs. Phillips, smiling as she reached for her bread. Mrs. Phillips blinked. "I beg your pardon. The roses by the eastern fence," the girl said simply. "They nearly died 3 summers ago, did not they, from the blight? But you did not give up on them." Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon. There had indeed been a blight one that nearly wiped out her entire garden. She had spoken of it to no one but her husband. Not even the congregation had known the full extent of it. When pressed, Rebecca merely shrugged. "I saw them in a dream. Bright and hurting." That was the moment Pastor Phillips noted something in his journal he would never written before. "The girl smiles like a child, but sees like a prophet. My wife says she looked into her. I say it is the wind through the door bringing something with it." Throughout history, there have been stories of children who knew too much. In 19th century Scotland, the Brahan seer was said to have predicted royal deaths. In Tsarist Russia, tales circulated of orphans who could describe palaces they would never seen. Appalachian folklore is littered with accounts of sighted young uns, children who saw ghosts, heard whispers, and knew when someone would die. But rarely had there been documented consistency. And rarer still were cases like the Morrison twins, whose every utterance would soon be recorded and later verified. This was not cold reading. This was not vague premonition. This was truth that pierced the soul, the type of truth people build walls to forget. That night, Rachel had a fever. She barely ate. She barely spoke. Ezekiel carried her to the guest bed, wrapped her in wool, and sat beside her for hours with a hand on her brow. Rebecca sat awake by the fire, eyes unfocused, lips moving as if in conversation with someone unseen. Pastor Phillips pretended not to notice, but in his journal he wrote, "I do not believe in ghosts. Yet the child watches shadows as if they speak. This is not a ghost story. Not exactly. No spirits slammed doors. No cold spots crept up spines. No eerie music whispered through the air. And yet every moment felt haunted. Not by the dead, but by something older. By truth. Truth that had been buried for too long under boards, beneath sermons, behind piety. Truth that had waited 16 years to surface. And now, with the arrival of 2 small girls in worn shoes, it had found its way back. The wind in Pine Hollow changed that night. Dogs barked at nothing. Smoke curled the wrong way from chimneys. And in the old church beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar, something began to stir. Not physically, but spiritually. The weight of memory, the pressure of justice, the return of the forgotten. By morning, the mist in Pine Hollow had grown so thick it seemed to press against the windows, blurring the outlines of barns and treetops, cloaking everything in pale silence. The town moved slowly under the weight of it, as if some invisible pressure had settled in overnight. Even the roosters crowed with less conviction. Pastor Phillips rose before dawn, as always, but found himself hesitating at the window, staring out into the gray murk that swallowed the footpath to the church. He was a man who believed in order, routine, and scripture. But something about the Morrison family had unsettled him. The father's weariness. The girl's calm intensity. Rebecca's comment about the roses. It had all seemed too much. He had seen traveling preachers before, had welcomed them, fed them, given them his pulpit for a day or two. They always moved on. But none had left a feeling like this, a hush beneath the surface, as if they had brought something into Pine Hollow that did not belong in the world of men. And yet he could not explain it, not to his wife, not to himself, not even to God. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting beside the fading embers of last night's fire. The man looked like he had not slept. His Bible lay open in his lap, unread. His eyes were distant. "She had dreams again," Ezekiel said quietly, as if continuing a conversation they had not started. "Both of them. Pastor Phillips did not ask what kind of dreams. He had a feeling he already knew. Instead, he asked the only thing he could think to say, "What do they see?" Ezekiel's hand tightened around the edge of the Bible. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Places we have not been yet. People we have not met. Things buried that should not be. And sometimes, things that should have stayed buried. At that exact moment, Rebecca stepped into the room. Her hair was tousled from sleep, her feet bare against the cold floorboards, but her eyes were sharp, alert. She walked straight to Pastor Phillips and said, in a tone both childlike and impossibly adult, "In your church, beneath the third floorboard from the altar, there is something hidden. Something you do not want anyone to find." Phillips blinked. The air left his lungs like he had been struck. He swallowed. "What do you mean, child?" Rachel followed behind, her small frame nearly ghost-like in the early morning gloom. She did not speak right away, but her presence felt heavier than it should have, as though she had carried something with her into the room that no one could see. "It is a bottle," Rachel said softly. "Brown glass. Wrapped in blue cloth. A baby's blanket, maybe. It smells like sorrow." The pastor sat down. He did not remember deciding to do so. One moment he was standing. The next, he was in his chair, staring at the floor. He knew what they were talking about. 3 months ago, during one of his darker evenings, Phillips had hidden a bottle of whiskey beneath the floorboards of the church. Not to drink, he told himself, just to remind him of his weakness. To prove to God and to himself that he could resist it. He had wrapped it in an old blue blanket fragment, the only thing he had left, of the son he had lost 5 years prior. No one knew about that. Not even his wife. And yet these two girls, who had arrived less than 12 hours ago, had named it in detail. Even the cloth. Even the scent. "I used to think they were just intuitive," Ezekiel said quietly. "Like their mother. Sarah always had a way of sensing things. Who was lying, who was sick, what was about to happen in a family." He looked at the girls now, and his eyes were full of something that looked almost like grief. But this is something else. Rebecca had sat down by the hearth, warming her hands. Rachel remained standing, silent, watching the pastor like she was reading the story of his life, written across his posture. "It is not that we choose what to see," Rebecca said suddenly. "We do not. The dreams find us. Sometimes we wake up crying. Sometimes we do not sleep at all. And what we always remember what we see." Pastor Phillips tried to speak. Failed. Tried again. "How long have they been like this?" "Since before they could talk," Ezekiel said. "Their first words were not about animals or toys. They were about people they would never met, places we had not visited, things no one had told them." He looked at Phillips, weary beyond years. "At first I thought it was a gift, that maybe God had blessed them for the hardship of their birth. But now," he trailed off, "now it felt like a burden. What happened that Sunday would be remembered by every living soul in Pine Hollow, and passed down by the few who survived long enough to tell it." The sermon itself was unremarkable. Ezekiel preached with passion and clarity, urging confession, redemption, and truth. He spoke of faith as light in a dark land, of the need to cleanse the soul. But it was what came after that changed everything. As the congregation began to shuffle toward the doors, Rebecca stepped forward. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "Mr. Turner," she said. Samuel Turner was a man of standing in the community. Owned the largest farm. Donated generously. He turned with a smile until she kept speaking. "You have been taking money from the collection plate, have not you?" "Not much. Just a little." "You plan to put it back? But it has been 6 months now." The blood drained from his face. Rebecca tilted her head. "Papa says God forgives those who repent. But it is hard to repent if you are still lying." Rachel moved beside her, locking eyes with Martha Whitfield, the community's oldest and most respected widow. "Your husband did not die in a farming accident, did he?" Rachel asked gently. "He left. And you still hide his letters." Gasps. Silence. Mrs. Whitfield looked like she would been punched. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Her hands shook. The twins moved through the crowd like shadows. Quiet. Methodical. exposing rot beneath the surface of the town's piety. To Dr. Hayes, they whispered about the patients who had died under his care, not from illness, but from ignorance. Mistakes he had buried under false diagnoses. To the Miller family, they asked why they kept their son locked in the attic, ashamed of his simple mind. To young Thomas Brett, they described in detail the secret meetings he had been having with Elizabeth Carter, who was, unfortunately, already married. It was not the tone that terrified people. The girls were not accusatory. They were not angry. They spoke like children describing the weather. And maybe that is what made it worse. Rebecca walked to the front of the church and laid her small hand on the wooden cross. "This is sacred ground," she said quietly. "But it has been stained." She looked directly at Pastor Phillips. "The Whitman family did not die in a house fire, did they? No one moved. They died here. In this room, and some of you know why." The silence was suffocating. It stretched so long that even the wind seemed to stop breathing. Everyone had heard of the Whitmans. Their deaths had been recorded in the town's early history. A fire, they said. Tragic. Sudden. Entire family gone, husband, wife, twin daughters. All buried in the churchyard. But now a different story was pressing against the town's fragile memory like a knife through old cloth. It was Elder Thompson who stood, 73 years old, one of Pine Hollow's founders. His voice cracked like old timber as he looked at Rebecca. "You speak of things you could not possibly know." Rebecca turned to him, unblinking. Hope had a silver locket with her mother's hair inside. Faith had a wooden doll their father carved. They were hiding here the night they died. Not in their house, right here. Behind the altar. Her voice did not tremble. But others did. Rachel added, "Hope had a fever. That is why she wore her nightgown instead of a Sunday dress. Faith had on her blue dress. The one with the torn hem." The weight of those words fell like ash across the congregation. Because they were true. Impossibly, undeniably true. And in that moment, everyone knew it. Even the ones who had tried for 16 years to forget. The church emptied slowly that day. Not in the usual trickle of handshakes and quiet chatter, but in stunned silence. Conversations died before they began. Eyes avoided each other. Husbands did not speak to wives. Friends averted their gazes. The air in Pine Hollow had changed. Something sacred had been fractured. No one said the word curse, not yet. But they thought it, and somewhere deep in the bones of the church floor, the woods seemed to remember every unspoken confession. Pastor Phillips stayed behind. He sat alone in the front pew, long after the others had gone, staring at the altar where Rebecca had placed her hand. Her words echoed in his mind, not because they were loud, but because they rang with impossible precision. The Whitman girls. Their doll. The locket. The fever. The nightgown. The hiding. Every detail she had uttered matched the faint memories whispered between elders for years. Details not recorded in official histories. Not even mentioned in sermons. And that is what made it so terrifying, because Rebecca and Rachel Morrison had never been to Pine Hollow before. They were born after the supposed fire. They had no way of knowing, unless someone or something had told them. Later that evening, in the Phillips household, Mrs. Phillips stirred soup over the fire, but her hands trembled. She glanced at the twins seated near the window and whispered to her husband, "They are not right, William. Something in them. It is not natural." He did not reply. Rebecca sat cross-legged, absently plucking dust from the hem of her skirt, humming a tune no one recognized. Rachel sat still, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Every few minutes, she would tilt her head, as if listening to someone whispering from far away. "They do not choose the dreams," Ezekiel said from the corner. "They never have." Pastor Phillips turned toward him. "You believe that?" "I do," the father answered. "Because I have seen the cost." He stood and walked over to his daughters, placing a hand gently on each of their heads. "They do not get to be children, Pastor. They carry the dead with them." Rachel blinked and turned toward the men. "She is waiting," she said softly. "Faith. She wants you to see what Pastor Hayes left behind." Philip stiffened. "What did you say?" "There is a loose stone in the church foundation," Rebecca added. on the eastern side, beneath the alcove. There is something hidden there, something that explains what happened. Phillips did not sleep that night. By dawn, Pastor Phillips stood at the base of the church, shovel in hand, breath steaming in the cold. It did not take long. The loose stone was exactly where the girl said it would be. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, lay a small leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, but intact. He opened it, and time rewound. It was the handwriting of his predecessor, Pastor Macabre Hayes. A man remembered for his humility, diligence, and his silence. He had died shortly before Phillips arrived to take over the Pine Hollow congregation. Phillips had always wondered why a man so meticulous had left behind so few personal writings. Now he knew. The journal was not meant to be found. The entries began innocently. Notes about weather, prayers for the sick, observations about births and baptisms. But as Phillips read further, the tone darkened. Jacob Whitman has grown suspicious. One entry read, "He spoke to me after the Sunday sermon. Said the money used to buy the new church timber was not collected honestly. Said he saw something. Horseshoes commissioned for animals no longer living. Bags of coin passed in the dark. He thinks some of the elders are hiding something." A few pages later, "Last night, Jacob came to me again. He says they have been robbing travelers, that the trail is being watched, that some of the missing men reported to the sheriff were never missing at all, were buried in the forest. He says the elders killed them for their gold." Phillips stopped reading. His hands trembled. He pressed the journal to his chest and looked at the cross above the altar. December 21st, 1818. The final entry began. "Jacob brought his family to the church. Said they were in danger. I told him this was holy ground, that no blood could be shed here. But I was wrong. I heard the girls cry out. Then silence. I helped bury them. God forgive me." Phillips fell to his knees. It is easy to believe that places can be sacred, that a church can protect, a cross can absolve, a sanctuary can resist evil. But history teaches us otherwise. The Spanish Inquisition was conducted in chapels. Slaves were auctioned on church steps in colonial America. Children were abused in places that bore the name of God. Pine Hollow was not cursed because the land was bad. It was cursed because men used God to hide evil. Pastor Hayes had tried to resist, but fear kept him silent. And silence allowed the rot to spread. Until now, until the dreams came. The next morning, Phillips did what few pastors have ever done. He confessed from the pulpit. He read from Hayes's journal. He described the crimes not as rumor, but as documented history. And he told the town that the floor beneath their feet was no longer holy. It was hollowed out by lies. He asked for volunteers. A handful of men, some young and skeptical, some old and broken by guilt, gathered after the service. Together, they removed the third floorboard from the altar. They dug. 3 feet down, they found it. The bottle, brown glass, wrapped in a strip of blue fabric. Just as Rachel had said, Phillips did not speak. He did not weep. He simply placed the bottle on the altar and stepped back. The congregation did not applaud. No one spoke. They only watched, as if waiting for the ground to open beneath them. That night, the twins stood in the center of the church. They did not preach. They did not prophesy. They just spoke. "We do not want to see what we see," Rebecca began. "We do not like the voices," Rachel added. "But they are still talking. Some of them are angry. Some are just sad. They want you to remember them properly." The girls turned toward the pews, where familiar faces sat frozen. "The man with the gold watch," Rachel whispered. "The preacher with the coins sewn into his saddle. The land surveyor with a silver ring," Rebecca added. "They are all still here, waiting, watching." Someone began to cry. The following day, Pastor Phillips wrote a single line in his journal. "The wood beneath our feet knows the weight of truth, and it is beginning to crack." That night, the first beam in the church ceiling split. The next morning, a stained glass window shattered without wind, without storm. And every morning after, someone reported hearing voices from beneath the floor. Children crying, women praying, men begging, not loudly. Just enough to disturb sleep, just enough to be remembered. By the time the next Sunday arrived, Pine Hollow was no longer a community. It was a kettle, barely keeping its lid on. Rumors slithered like smoke through every cabin and creaky floorboard. People no longer walked the footpaths with greetings on their lips. They walked with eyes cast downward, hearts clenched, and memories uncoiling like snakes in the dark. The Morrison twins had awakened something ancient and unforgiving. Pastor Phillips, no longer the cautious man he once was, had begun reading from both the scripture and the hidden journal of Pastor Hayes. Each entry was another hammer blow to the foundation of Pine Hollow's innocence. But it was not the facts alone that disturbed people. It was the precision of the girls' visions. Names, dates, articles of clothing, items no living person could recall until the girls spoke of them. And now, with the entire congregation gathered once more in the church, everyone was waiting for the final fracture. It came not from the pulpit, but from the pews. It started with Samuel Turner. His hands trembled. He could not look anyone in the eye. He stood slowly, as if rising from decades of silence rather than from a wooden bench. "I took the money," he said. Gasps. Then silence. "I told myself I would return it. That I was borrowing from the church for my farm. I was wrong." Rebecca did not move. She simply nodded, as if that was all he needed to say. Turner sat back down, tears streaking his weathered face. But the spell had been broken. Others stood. Martha Whitfield admitted the truth about her husband's disappearance, that he had run off with the last of their coin, leaving her pregnant and humiliated, that she had fabricated the story of his death to protect her children's reputations. Dr. Hayes confessed to forging credentials from a university he would never attended, that several of the deaths he would declare natural were the results of his own misdiagnoses, that he lived with the guilt of knowing he had done harm while trying to do good. Each confession was a weight, lifted but not erased. Communities like Pine Hollow do not run on law. They run on fear, faith, and shame. And shame, when buried, does not dissolve, it ferments. Over time, it becomes something else. Defensiveness, cruelty, paranoia. The people of Pine Hollow did not think of themselves as evil. They told themselves their lies protected families, that their omissions were for the greater good, but truth has a half-life longer than any secret. And it always leaks through. Sometimes it takes a tragedy. Sometimes it takes a child. In Pine Hollow's case, it took two. As the congregation murmured and shifted under the weight of these confessions, Rebecca stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "This church is not clean," she said. The air grew colder. Some said later they saw frost forming on the windows, though no one remembered seeing snow outside that morning. Rebecca walked to the altar again, her hand grazing the wood. The Whitman family did not die in a fire. They died right here. You know this. Rachel stood beside her, and they were not alone. Every head turned toward Elder Thompson. The old man sat frozen, as if the years had suddenly returned to his face all at once. His hands clenched the pew. His lips moved, forming a prayer or perhaps a plea. Rebecca's voice remained steady. Faith and hope were hiding behind the altar. Their mother was pregnant. 8 months along, you knew that. A long pause. "Tell them," Rachel whispered. Elder Thompson stood, and for a moment it looked like he might deny everything. He had built his entire life on the image of righteousness, but guilt wears a man thin, and after 16 years, the cracks had become impossible to seal. His voice was cracked and hoarse when he finally spoke. "It is true. No one moved. I was there the night Jacob brought his family to the church. He came to warn us, to beg us to stop. He had discovered what the others were doing. The travelers, the money, the graves. He looked at Pastor Phillips. I told him he was threatening everything we would build. That we were too far in. That the community needed to survive, even if it meant sacrifice." He closed his eyes. We followed them. We cornered them. We told ourselves we would only scare him. But Mary screamed. The girls ran. Jacob fought. His shoulders slumped. And in the end, they all died. There was no protest, no cries of denial, only the kind of silence that comes after a funeral. The next day, a rider arrived from the east. He was well-dressed, clean-shaven, out of place among the bearded, flannel-draped mountain folk. He introduced himself as Thomas Brennan, solicitor from Lexington. "I have been tracing the estate of a man named Marcus Webb," he said. There were, inconsistencies in his travel records, and a large sum of money that was never accounted for. Pastor Phillips paled. He remembered the name. Pastor Hayes had written it in his journal. A traveler, wealthy, vanished without explanation in the winter of 1818. I have reason to believe, Brennan continued, that Webb passed through this region shortly before his disappearance, and that the settlement of Pine Hollow may have been involved in his fate. Rebecca entered the room as if on cue. His watch is buried behind the church, she said, startling Brennan. Gold. Cracked glass. His initials on the inside. M.W. Brennan turned white. How do you know that? That was never made public. Rachel stepped beside her sister. It is with his money bag. And the bridle from his horse. Elder Thompson buried them together. Pastor Phillips felt the room tilt again. The solicitor blinked. Then I suggest we dig. Within the hour, a group of men, some curious, some terrified, had gathered behind the church with shovels in hand. 3 feet down, they struck metal. The pocket watch was exactly as described. So was the bag. So was the bridle. Thomas Brennan held the watch in shaking fingers, then turned toward Pastor Phillips. This community, he said, was funded with murder, and no one had the courage to argue with him. History loves stories with clean endings. A hero. A villain. A redemption arc. But Pine Hollow was not that kind of place. It was a wound stitched together with scripture, silence, and superstition. And the Morrison twins had ripped the stitches open. They were not saints. They were not devils. They were mirrors. And what they showed, Pine Hollow, was itself. They began digging at dawn. The earth behind the church was damp, clinging to the shovels like it did not want to let go of what it held. No one spoke. Even the birds stayed silent, as if they too were watching from the trees, understanding that this moment had nothing to do with nature and everything to do with reckoning. Sheriff Mackenzie, summoned by Brennan the solicitor the previous night, stood with arms crossed, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. He was not a man given to superstitions or ghosts, but even he could not deny the chill crawling up his spine as the Morrison girls stood nearby, holding hands, eyes locked on the growing pit. 3 feet down, the metal clinked a hollow, final sound. A tarnished gold watch, cracked across its face. M.W. engraved delicately on the inside of the lid. Then the bag. Then the rotted bridle. One by one, pieces of a buried truth pulled from the soil like bones of a long, dead beast. Brennan did not say a word. He simply knelt, held the watch against the morning light, and nodded. This, he said, was stolen from Marcus Webb. This is proof. But everyone already knew. They had known the moment the first shovel pierced the ground. The church was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. Inside, Pastor Phillips knelt on the altar steps, hands pressed together, not in prayer, but in guilt. His head hung low. He had preached the word for years from atop a grave he never knew was there but should have. He had felt the wrongness in the floorboards, the strange dreams that sometimes plagued his sleep, the cold that lingered even in summer. He thought it was mountain air. Now he knew better. The bones of the murdered had whispered through every sermon. And then came the twins. Rebecca and Rachel stood just behind him, their eyes far away. They did not look at each other. They did not have to. They were speaking silently, without words, with something no one else could hear. When Rachel finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper, yet it filled the space like thunder. "There are more!" Pastor Phillips turned, face pale. "More?" Rebecca answered. "More bodies. Some are in the old mine shaft, others in Devil's Creek. And some 3 of them are under this very floor." Silence again. A heavy, suffocating silence. Sheriff Mackenzie's boots thudded against the wood as he entered. "Are you saying this church is built over human remains?" Rachel nodded. "Not all of it. Just the left side of the sanctuary, near the window where the wind always comes through." The sheriff looked to Judge Harrison, who had arrived late the previous night with 2 federal marshals and a territorial court order. "We will dig," the judge said, his voice grim, resolute. "If they are right again, you have to know." The floorboards came up one by one. It took 2 days. Phillips insisted it be done with care, with respect. This was no ordinary excavation. This was a dissection of a lie, and the lie bled through every nail removed, every beam lifted, every stone disturbed. On the third morning, the soil gave way. Bones, human bones. 3 complete skeletons, tangled in the roots of the church's foundation, as if the very earth had tried to swallow them back down. With the skeletons came items, tokens of identity, of history, of lives stolen. A silver ring with the initials J.P., a finely carved knife with a merchant's emblem etched into its hilt, and worst of all, a copper cross, delicate and twisted, still draped around the neck of one of the dead. Pastor Phillips recognized it. He had seen it once in a sketch described in a letter from a grieving widow to a bishop in Tennessee. It had belonged to a preacher named Robert Chen. Gone missing. Never found. Until now. The judge said nothing for a long while. Then he spoke just 3 words. They were right. And with those words, the final illusion of Pine Hollow shattered. No one could deny it now. The church had been built with stolen money. The land consecrated with innocent blood. The sermons preached above the dead. But perhaps more horrifying than the crimes themselves was the method, the ritualistic precision of it. This was not panic. This was not a crime of desperation. It was a system. A machine of murder disguised as salvation. And for years, it had worked. Pastor Phillips stood before his congregation on the 4th night, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but filled with purpose. "We are not who we thought we were," he began. "We were not built by righteousness. We were built by silence. And the dead do not forgive silence." No one interrupted. No one disagreed. Because just then, the wind that had haunted the church for years grew still, and in the stillness came clarity. Rebecca stood. She did not ask permission. She did not wait. She simply walked to the altar and spoke. "Hope and faith were their names," she said. "But they are not alone anymore. The others, the travelers, they speak too. Some whisper, some scream, but all of them want to be known." Rachel joined her. "They told us where the rest are," she said. "The mine, the creek, the places the elders thought would stay forgotten. But the land remembers." That night, the excavation widened. Men with lanterns and ropes descended into the mine shaft east of town. Bones were found there too. Clothing, saddles, wedding rings, tokens of men who were missed, mourned, and never found until 2 9-year-old girls dreamed of them. The sheriff wept, the judge wrote. The townspeople stood in vigil. But perhaps the most unforgettable moment came not from the revelations, or the confessions, or even the bones, but from Elder Thompson. Shackled, withered, near collapse from guilt, he stood before the church and spoke not as a criminal, but as a man finally released from a prison of his own making. "We killed them because we were afraid," he said. "Afraid of being poor, afraid of hunger, afraid of failure, but most of all, we were afraid of losing power. We told ourselves God would forgive us, that we could buy grace with stone and timber. But you cannot build salvation on corpses." Rebecca stepped forward. Her voice, calm and piercing, followed his confession. "The twins," she said, "faith and hope. Their mother carried 2 more. Unborn, they died with her that night. And they have been trying to speak ever since." The church went silent again, not in fear this time, but in grief. For the first time in decades, real grief bloomed in Pine Hollow. The next morning, Judge Harrison signed an order. The church would be dismantled. Not simply closed. Dismantled. Every board, every window, every pew. The land would be returned to the earth. The bones buried properly. The names engraved on stone. The people of Pine Hollow watched as the building came down. Some cried, some prayed, some simply stared. And the Morrison twins, they stood together on the hill overlooking the cemetery, their faces expressionless, their eyes wide. As the final beam was lowered, Rachel whispered, "They are quieter now." Rebecca nodded. "Faith and hope are ready to rest. But then, just as the last wall crumbled, Rachel's eyes snapped to the east. "Not all of them," she said. "Not yet." The sky over Pine Hollow turned a dull, ashen gray, as if mourning what the town had become. The wind that once howled through the mountains had quieted to a breathless pause, holding its silence like a witness refusing to speak. But beneath that silence, something moved, something old and waiting, ready to rise again through the pages of memory and the voices of the dead. Pastor Phillips sat alone by candlelight, surrounded by piles of brittle pages and faded ink. The floor beneath him was no longer trusted. The altar, dismantled, the sanctuary stripped to its bones. And yet it was in this stripped, bare state that the truth began to finally speak. He had gathered every ledger, every diary, every church record, dating back to the town's founding in 1818. They were dusty, incomplete, and faded in places as though time itself had tried to smudge out the sins they described. But between the gaps and the omissions, a pattern emerged. Not through what was said, but through what was not. There were no death records for Marcus Webb, for Samuel Collins, for William Morse. Only vague notes disappeared while traveling, last seen on the trail, presumed lost, not even a mention of their passing in church prayers. No names etched into cemetery stones. No eulogies. No closure. They had simply seen, vanished. Except now, their bones had come back. And the question that clawed at Phillips like a fever was this: how had the girls known? Not guessed. Not sensed. Known. He lit another candle, opened Hayes's private journal, and returned to the final entries. December 20th, 1818. Jacob Whitman came again. This time he brought evidence. He says Webb never reached Tennessee. He showed me the saddlebag still bearing the Lexington seal. Inside, a letter of land transfer. And gold coins. I told him not to confront the elders yet. I begged him to wait. But he would not. He said if the church would not act, the courts would. December 21st. The night was long. I heard the voices in the church. Jacob's. Mary's. Then the girls crying. And then, nothing. When I came in the morning, the altar was stained. Elder Thompson told me what had to be done. We bury the past, he said, or it buries us. December 22nd. I agreed to their plan. We moved the bodies before dawn. The girls wrapped in their mother's shawl. The man placed beneath the hearth. I have sinned beyond forgiveness. Phillips dropped the journal. He sat back, heart pounding in his chest, bile rising in his throat. They had not just murdered the Whitmans. They had erased them, and they had built their church upon the very bones of that erasure. Outside, the hammering had stopped. The workers had finished dismantling the last of the church's framework. Only the floor remained. The boards over the graves, the space where prayers had been spoken over rot. He stepped outside and found the twins standing barefoot on the soil where the altar once stood. They did not turn to greet him. They were staring at the ground. She was 8 months pregnant, Rachel said quietly. They thought the babies would not matter. But they do, Rebecca added. They still cry. Pastor Phillips's throat tightened. What do they want? Rachel looked up at him, and her eyes were far older than 9. They want someone to remember. Someone to grieve them the way they deserved. They want to be children again. Not ghosts. Phillips felt something shift in his chest, a fracture. Not a breaking, but a soft giving way. The kind that comes when denial finally loses its grip. We will give them that, he said. I swear it. But the girls did not smile. Because there was still more. That evening, Thomas Brennan returned from the county seat, having filed the necessary writs to open a full investigation. With him came Judge Harrison and 2 new marshals. They brought with them orders to search every structure in Pine Hollow, every shed, cellar, and crawl space. The entire town had become a crime scene. The judge convened a temporary court in what used to be the schoolhouse. Elder Thompson sat shackled in the front row, his hands folded, head bowed. Marcus Perry and Samuel Bradford, the last surviving members of the original leadership council, were brought in separately. They had stopped protesting. Their silence now was not defense, it was surrender. One by one, the Morrison twins were brought before the judge again. "How do you know what you know?" Harrison asked for the third time. Rebecca did not flinch. "They tell us." Not with voices, always. Sometimes it is pictures. Sometimes it is just knowing. Like someone else's memories in our heads. The judge rubbed his temples. "And why you? Why not someone else?" Rachel answered this time. "Because no one else listens." Harrison sighed. He turned to Phillips. "Do you believe them?" Phillips nodded. "I did not. But I do now." The judge leaned forward. "Are they haunted?" Phillips shook his head. "No, they are not haunted. They are carrying the haunting for us." That night, the search continued. The mine shaft gave up 2 more skeletons. Devil's Creek, once thought too wild to be explored, offered up boots and a rusted revolver with initials matching one of the missing traders from 1819. Beneath an old granary, a cellar was discovered. Inside, a trunk. Inside the trunk, a journal. Not a preacher's this time. A merchant's, Samuel Collins. The entry stopped Pastor Phillips cold. "They offered me lodging. Said the trail ahead was treacherous. I trusted them. They wore crosses. They spoke scripture. But I woke to hands around my throat. If anyone finds this, know that I did nothing wrong. I only wanted to build a church. I only wanted to preach peace." The final page was blank. Phillips folded the journal and wept. By the end of the 5th day, the full scope of the crime had become undeniable. 11 travelers. Robbed. Murdered. Erased. Their belongings melted into the community. Their gold spent. Their blood washed away. And then the Whitmans slain not for gold, but for knowing too much. Judge Harrison stood before the people of Pine Hollow in the same spot where sermons had once called for salvation. "Your community is condemned," he said. "Every structure will be dismantled. Every grave exhumed. Restitution will be made to the families of the dead. What is salvageable will be sold. Pine Hollow, as a settlement, will cease to exist." There was no outcry. No protest. Just nods. And tears. And silence. But even as the court declared its sentence, the story was not over. Because Rebecca spoke again. "There is more," she said. Everyone turned. "The trail," she said. "It is still being used. The old one. The one through Devil's Gap." Rachel added. "Someone else has been watching it. Not the elders. Someone newer." The judge stared. "Are you saying the killings continued?" The girls did not answer. They did not have to, because across the valley, beyond the graveyard and the burned beams of the church, another rider had just disappeared into the trees, and the ghosts stirred once more. The wind shifted again, but this time it was not mourning. It was warning. Pine Hollow was no longer a town. It was an open wound, raw and exposed beneath the boots of sheriffs, judges, marshals, and truth-seeking ghosts. The dismantled church lay like the skeleton of a great beast, its ribs picked clean by justice. But beneath the surface, something deeper had begun to rot because the soil was not finished speaking. Sheriff Mackenzie's boots squelched in the thawing ground behind the church as he marked out another grid. The smell was heavier, now damp moss, disturbed memory, and something older. The judge had ordered a full excavation of the churchyard. Not just the places the twins had identified. All of it. Every unmarked grave. Every corner of the cemetery that had never held a headstone. The townspeople stood in the distance. Silent again. Not watching to judge, but watching to remember. To be forced to remember. Rebecca and Rachel stood to one side, arms linked, their dresses now dust-streaked and torn at the hem. They looked like children from another century, sent by some unspeakable mission to tear open the lies of men. The first body came up before noon. It was small, too small. Bones curled tightly, fetal, innocent. A baby. Then another. Then 2 more. "Twins," Rachel whispered. Hope and Faith were not the only ones. Sheriff Mackenzie removed his hat. No one asked how she knew. The graves began to multiply, each one older than the last. some so deep the workers had to reinforce the sides of the trenches. They found a man with a broken femur and gold dental inlays, clearly not local. A woman's remains with fine lace still clinging to her wrist bones, torn like it had fought to resist burial. A child, likely 7 or 8, missing a skull with splintered ribs. They did not find names, but Rebecca knew them. "That is Josiah Merritt," she said softly. "He had a ring with an eagle etched into the band. He was riding west from Roanoke. He never made it." Judge Harrison stared down at the skeleton. How could she possibly know that? Brennan did not answer. Neither did Phillips. No one could, because Josiah Merritt was recorded in Brennan's notes. One of the earliest missing travelers logged in 1817. His ring had been mentioned in a single letter, written by his wife to a Kentucky sheriff, asking if a body had ever been found. Now at last, it had. Rebecca pointed to the next pit. "There is a woman there. Her name was Catherine. She was pregnant when she died. She wore a red shawl. It was torn when they pushed her down the ravine, so they buried her instead," Rachel added. "She sings sometimes." The workers did not move for several minutes. When they finally dug, they found the bones, the fetal remains, and the red fabric. Brennan wept into his scarf. No one else moved. That evening, Pastor Phillips stood at what used to be the church entrance. He held the Bible, but it trembled in his hands, not because of faith lost, but because of something worse, faith betrayed. "We have desecrated everything we claimed to hold sacred," he said, "and now we are surrounded by the dead we buried twice, once in earth and once in silence." Rebecca's voice cut through the dusk. "But they never forgot." Rachel stood beside her. "And they never left." Phillips turned to the judge. "What do we do when our entire foundation was built on bones?" The judge replied without hesitation. "We build no more. We atone." The next day, Pine Hollow stopped pretending to be a town. Families packed wagons. Homes were boarded. Schools were abandoned. Every building that had touched blood money mills, granaries, storehouses was marked for sale or demolition. The funds, under Brennan's guidance, would go to the descendants of those who had vanished. The restitution would never be enough, but it would be something. Still, not everyone was content to leave. Elder Thompson sat on a bench near the old cemetery, hands folded in his lap. He stared at the open graves like a man awaiting judgment. He had confessed. He had accepted his sentence, but he had not run. "I will stay here," he said, "not because I deserve forgiveness, but because someone has to hear the names when they are whispered." Phillips knelt beside him. "Do you hear them often?" Thompson nodded. "At night, when I close my eyes. They do not blame me anymore. That is the worst part. They just want to be remembered." Rachel stood a few feet away. "They know you are sorry. But sorrow is not enough," Rebecca added. "You have to carry them. Until someone else does." As the grave count climbed past 20, federal marshals sent word to Washington. The story had outgrown its borders. What began as a regional investigation was now a federal case. Reporters began to appear riding dusty, exhausted, carrying ink-stained notebooks and cynical eyes. Most left shaken, because this was not a tale of bandits or one-off murders. It was a story of civilization built on silence. Of a town that had baptized itself in denial, and of 2 children who cracked open the lid of history with nothing more than dreams. That night, the last skeleton was unearthed. It belonged to a preacher. The remains were twisted, collapsed in a stone-lined pit near the eastern wall. Beside him, a rusted crucifix, a leather pouch of coins, and a torn letter. The letter was addressed to "My dearest Sarah." It had never been sent. The handwriting was perfect. The name at the bottom, Samuel Collins. Phillips read it aloud to a small crowd under the flickering lanterns. "I am frightened," the letter said. "Not of death, but of what it means to be forgotten. If this place swallows me, I pray that someone someday will hear my voice again. And no, I was not wicked. I only wanted to serve." Rebecca reached out and touched the bones. "You were heard," she whispered. "You were found." By sunrise, a marker stood above every grave. Wooden crosses for now, stone to come later. Beneath each, a name. Where names were missing, The twins provided what they could. Where the twins were silent, the town carved a phrase that became Pine Hollow's final act of repentance. Here lies one who should not have been forgotten. And the wind, after all those days of silence, blew gently through the trees. Not a howl, not a warning, but something like peace. The schoolhouse had never seen a crowd like this. Its worn benches, once built for the knees and elbows of children, now bowed under the weight of guilt, shame, and silence. Every adult in Pine Hollow was there, shoulder to shoulder, breathless and still, as Judge Harrison sat at the front table beneath the black, draped window, gavel in hand, Bible beside it, eyes like knives. There were no hymns that morning, no prayers, just the rustle of papers, the sound of ink scratching into permanence, and the shuffling of chains as Elder Thompson, Marcus Perry, and Samuel Bradford were led to the front, flanked by marshals. No one looked away. Because the time for looking away had ended, Rebecca and Rachel sat at the edge of the room, too small for the benches, too quiet for the noise inside their minds. They did not blink. They did not fidget. They watched. They listened. They remembered Judge Harrison's voice, when it came, was iron. This proceeding will serve as both formal indictment and public reckoning for the crimes committed under the banner of Pine Hollow between the years of 1817 and 1834. He looked to the men in chains. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Elder Thompson nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And how do you plead?" Thompson did not hesitate. "Guilty." So did Bradford. So did Perry. It was not the guilt of cornered men. It was the guilt of hollow men. Men who had lived in their own graves for years and now welcomed the weight of soil. Thomas Brennan rose to speak. His hands shook, but not from fear. From fury held tightly, professionally, beneath his vest. "The evidence we have uncovered confirms the murder of at least 22 individuals. 11 of them travelers along the Eastern Trail between 1818 and 1820. The others townsfolk or passers-by, silenced for what they knew." He paused. "And among the dead, 2 unborn children." A ripple of sorrow moved through the room, like wind through tall grass. Rebecca's eyes did not move. Rachel closed hers. "Further evidence," Brennan continued, "shows that the financial resources stolen from these victims were used to build this settlement, including its church, school, mill, and homes. This was not random violence. This was systemic exploitation. It was murder. For prosperity." Judge Harrison let the silence sink in before speaking again. "Elder Thompson, is this true?" Thompson nodded slowly. "Yes." The judge turned to the crowd. "Does any man or woman here dispute these facts?" No one answered. And so he continued, "For 16 years this town lived upon the bones of the innocent. And for 16 years the truth remained buried. It took 2 children. Children who should be thinking of stories and summer and songs to unearth what grown men could not bring themselves to speak aloud." He turned his gaze on Rebecca and Rachel. "Your Honor," Ezekiel Morrison interrupted gently, "my daughters have something to say." The judge gestured to the floor. "They may speak." Rebecca stood first. "My sister and I, we did not ask to see what we see. The dreams come without permission. But the people we dream about, they do not want revenge. They want remembrance." Rachel stood beside her. "They forgive," she said softly. "But forgiveness does not erase what was done. It does not build houses for the families left behind. It does not bring back babies buried without names." Her voice cracked. "But it helps." The judge nodded solemnly. "Indeed, it does." He raised the gavel. "Elder Thompson, Marcus Perry, Samuel Bradford, you are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder, unlawful concealment of bodies, and systemic fraud." The gavel came down. 3 thuds. 3 tombstones hammered into the record. The room exhaled, but the weight did not lift. Because Judge Harrison was not finished, he turned back to the people. "This settlement is condemned. The land upon which it stands will be sold. All proceeds are to be distributed to the verified descendants of the victims. The church will not be rebuilt. The name Pine Hollow will be struck from official records." The room trembled. A woman cried. A boy whispered to his mother. Where will we go? And then came the final question, the one that no one dared ask aloud. What happens to a people when their past becomes poison? That night, the Morrison family prepared to leave. Their wagon was small, packed only with what could be carried. They had been offered coin, land, a home. But Ezekiel refused. "We do not stay where the dead still scream," he said. Pastor Phillips walked them to the edge of the hollow. The girls rode side by side, wrapped in wool, eyes distant. "I failed them," Phillips said quietly. Ezekiel shook his head. "No. You listened. When no one else would." The pastor watched the girls, then asked the question that had haunted him since the day they arrived. "What will happen to them?" Ezekiel did not look away. "They will dream. They will carry. And they will break more silences in more towns. Until the world is quieter." Phillips placed a hand on the wagon rail. "Do you think they will ever find peace?" The father hesitated. Then, "Only when the truth no longer needs a child's voice to be heard." The wagon creaked down the trail, and behind them, Pine Hollow dissolved. 3 weeks after the last body was unearthed from Pine Hollow's cursed earth, the first letter arrived. Then came another. And another. By the end of the month, more than 50 letters had reached the office of Judge Harrison and the table of Solicitor Thomas Brennan. They came from Tennessee, Ohio, Virginia, even as far as New York, handwritten, inked in grief and hope. "My grandfather vanished on the trail in 1819. We never found his body. My aunt was traveling through the Appalachian foothills when she disappeared. Her last letter mentioned a stop in Pine Hollow. I think one of the names on the list is my brother." What had been a buried wound was now a nationwide reckoning. The archives of Pine Hollow were copied and sent to historical societies. Old photographs were compared to forensic drawings. Items, rings, buttons, journal pages were matched to long-lost family heirlooms. And as each match was confirmed, something strange began to happen. People started to arrive, not in anger, not in vengeance, but with candles, with flowers, with stories. They came to the field where the church once stood. They stood by the rows of new grave markers, reading the inscriptions aloud as if trying to awaken something still clinging to the air. Rebecca had said the dead wanted to be remembered. Now, they were. A man in his 70s came to kneel beside a cross marked Josiah Merritt, beloved father. He placed a silver pocket watch in the dirt. "My father carried this," he whispered. "He always said if anything happened to him, it would find its way home." Another woman, middle-aged, held her mother's hand and stared at the stone that read Catherine and Unborn. She touched her belly, now long since empty of the life it once bore. "You were not alone," she said. "You were never alone." They brought more than grief. They brought music, old hymns, mountain songs, prayers whispered in French, German, Gaelic. One Cherokee elder came and sprinkled sage across the graves. "They walk now," she said. "Not trapped anymore." In a nearby town, Pastor Phillips had taken temporary residence in a borrowed parsonage. He no longer wore the black robes of Pine Hollow. He no longer held a congregation. He simply wrote. Every morning, he sat by a window and filled page after page of a new journal. Not of sermons, of names. He had vowed to write one name each day. Every person they found. Every detail the twins revealed. Every soul once silenced. He did not know what the writings would become. A book. A memorial. A confession. But he knew it had to be done, because silence was no longer acceptable. Rebecca and Rachel did not return to Pine Hollow, but the dreams did. In the nights that followed, they began whispering to them about other places, other towns, other ghosts, and something else, something darker. Rebecca began waking in tears again. Rachel stopped eating for 2 days. "It is happening elsewhere," Rachel whispered. Ezekiel did not ask what. He already knew. Truth does not rot in one place. It spreads. It festers. And when no one listens, it learns to scream. Back at the gravesite, a monument was raised. Not of marble. Of ironwood, a tree cut down in silence and shaped by the hands of those who had once kept secrets. Carved into it, in 2 simple lines, this land was consecrated by innocence and corrupted by fear. May no child ever carry what we forced ours to bear. No politicians spoke at the unveiling. No clergy preached. The only voices were the descendants reading letters from the past, pages recovered from trunks and barns and fireboxes, carried through generations of wondering. I waited every morning by the window. She said she saw him in a dream, smiling. We never stopped praying. And then one day, without warning, a package arrived on Judge Harrison's desk. Inside, a small linen pouch. Inside that, teeth. Human teeth. Filed at the tips, and a note. In a trembling hand. I remember what happened in Dry Creek. They took him. They said he would not be missed. I still hear him in the trees. The judge stared at the note for a long time. Then he looked out the window toward the ridgeline. Pine Hollow had fallen, but the forest had not, and perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all. There are moments in a child's life when the world tilts subtly, irreversibly, and suddenly they know more than they should. For most children, that moment comes slowly, a truth glimpsed in an argument behind closed doors, a cruel word shouted on a playground, a funeral, a goodbye. For Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, that moment never ended. It was a constant, a living echo in their bones, a gift that spoke in voices not their own, and it was killing them slowly. The town of Ashfield had given them a room, a quiet one, with tall windows and thick curtains, the kind of room people gave orphans or prophets or troubled guests. No one knew how to explain. It smelled of lavender and old wood. There was tea every morning, a basin for washing, dolls no one played with anymore, but the dreams did not care. They came like storms. That night, Rachel woke up screaming. Rebecca was already sitting upright in bed. They were buried alive, Rachel whispered. I heard the dirt hit the lid. Rebecca nodded. The man was singing. He knew it was coming. He wanted someone to hear. Ezekiel entered the room silently, kneeling between their beds. Where? He asked gently. Rachel shook her head. Not here. Far east. The trees are older. The water smells different, Rebecca added. And there is a man with a bell. He rings it before it happens. Ezekiel closed his eyes. It was beginning again. They stopped traveling for a month. Ezekiel said it was rest. The truth was darker. Rebecca had begun to bleed from her ears after one dream. Rachel developed tremors in her left hand. Doctors said it was stress, lack of sleep, malnutrition. But the girls knew better. We are not meant to carry this, Rachel whispered one night. Rebecca looked at her sister's thin arms. But no one else can. It was not pride. It was resignation. They had become vessels, mediums, not by choice, but by design. The world had shaped them for this, made brittle their bones, made fragile their childhoods, carved out space inside them where no joy could fully live. And yet, they continued, because what else could they do? Word had spread. They were no longer just the twins from Pine Hollow. They were the sleepwalkers, the witch children, the eyes of the past. Letters followed them. Pleas, confessions. Some begged for their help. Others begged them to stay away. And sometimes, people came in person. A woman arrived with a Bible and a bottle of arsenic. She knelt before them, sobbing. They never found my son, she said. Please, please make the voices stop. A man brought a lantern and a ledger filled with names of men he claimed were still alive, still killing. I can't sleep, he said. I dream about what they did. Maybe you can make them stop. Rebecca took the ledger. Rachel took the woman's hand. Ezekiel stood behind them both, unable to breathe. This was not a gift anymore. It was a sentence. One morning, they found a box on their doorstep. Inside, a hand-carved mask, painted white, featureless, and a note. We remember what you saw. There was no signature, just a smear of ash across the paper. Rebecca began to change. She stopped drawing. She stopped humming. She stared more and spoke less. Rachel noticed her hair falling out, little strands in the basin. On the pillow, one night, Rachel asked her, "Do you hate it?" Rebecca blinked slowly. The knowing. Rachel nodded. Rebecca's answer came in a whisper, I do not hate it. I hate that they won't let us forget." Rachel looked at her hands. "Do you think they will ever stop?" Rebecca did not answer, because some questions are not meant to have answers. Not from children. Ezekiel considered taking them back to the mountains, to the place they were born, to somewhere without ghosts. But he knew that was a lie. The ghosts were everywhere. The knowing had no borders. It came in rivers, in wind, in dreams, and no matter where they went, someone would eventually come with a question too heavy for science, too ancient for law, and too broken for prayer. And two girls would be asked to carry it again. In a field on the edge of town, they burned the mask. Rachel said it did not scream, but it cracked. Rebecca said it did not cry, but the flames turned blue. They watched in silence until it was nothing but ash. Then they walked away. No tears, no words, because they would learn what the world did not want to admit. Some burdens are not meant to be shared. Some truths rot too deep for light. And some children are never allowed to grow old. Spring came late that year. The fields thawed slower than usual. Snow clung to tree branches long after the sun had returned. It was as if the world itself was not ready to let go, not of winter, not of memory, not of what had happened in Pine Hollow. In the valley once called by that name, wildflowers began to grow where graves had been. Yellow-tongued violets, bloodroot, little white blossoms locals called ghost buttons. No one replanted them. No one tilled the soil. Nature had simply decided to reclaim what men had ruined. A wooden sign remained at the trailhead, weathered, carved with names, a warning and a memorial. Most travelers passed it without stopping, but some paused, read, and walked slower after. Far from the valley, in a town whose name history would also forget, Rachel sat alone on a bench outside a shuttered chapel. She was older now, not quite a woman, not quite a child. Somewhere between sleep and wake. Her sister had taken ill, gone quiet for days. Doctors said it was exhaustion. Rachel knew better. "She is somewhere else," she whispered to no one. "She is listening." Behind her, the chapel doors creaked. A man stepped out, middle-aged, hollow-eyed. He held something wrapped in canvas. "I heard about you," he said. Rachel did not respond. "I do not believe in ghosts," he added. "But I have not slept in 12 years. She turned her head slightly. "What happened 12 years ago?" He said nothing, just handed her the bundle. Inside, a painting of a woman. Her eyes scratched out, her dress stained. "My wife painted that," the man said. "The night before she drowned." Rachel ran her fingers over the dried brushstrokes. "You want to know what it means?" she asked. The man nodded. Rachel looked up at him. "No," she said gently. "You do not." In another state, an academic began compiling a book titled Children Who Dream of the Dead. It was meant to be psychological, objective, scientific. But by the third chapter, he had stopped citing sources and started confessing. "I do not know what is real anymore," he wrote. "But I know I am afraid of sleep." The book never made it to print, but photocopies of the manuscript were found in university archives years later, with handwritten annotations in the margins. Circles, crossed out names, one phrase written repeatedly. They are the ledger. Years passed. Rebecca never fully recovered, but she began speaking again, only at night, only in dreams. Rachel recorded her whispers on old tape reels. Some of them were nonsense. Others were not. "Do not go west. The water remembers. There is something beneath the chapel in Redstone. The woman in green is not a woman." Rachel cataloged them all, not because she wanted to know, but because someone, someday, would. Ezekiel Morrison died quietly, in his sleep. No pain, no dreams. He left behind no will, no money, just a letter addressed to whoever's listening. It read, "If you are reading this, then you are a seeker. But beware, the truth does not reward the curious, it punishes them. My daughters bore the cost. I only watched, and I will never forgive myself for that. If you meet a girl with eyes like river stones, who says things she should not know, listen, and then walk away. Don't ask her to carry your ghosts. They are not hers to bear. The twins never became famous. No monuments were raised in their honor. No newspaper followed their steps. But in hushed corners of certain towns, in the backs of old libraries, and in the stories told only after midnight, people remembered the children who knew too much, the hollow that was never mapped, the crimes no one spoke of, but everyone carried. And in those stories, the girls never aged. They remained as they were, two small figures in the doorway of a decaying church, staring at sins older than themselves. Eyes open, mouths closed, and silence louder than any sermon. One autumn evening, long after most of the world had moved on, Rachel stood at the edge of a hill overlooking a forgotten town. The wind was cold, the trees bare. She did not say anything, didn't cry. She simply placed a single stone on the ground, carved into it, "We did not ask to remember." Then she turned and walked into the mist, and the fog closed behind her, like it always did. Because some truths are not buried. They wait. They whisper. And when the world grows quiet enough, they speak. Again.